So as I mentioned, we're going to get started very, very soon, couple of minutes. I'm Sarah. Obviously, I'm going to take you through this presentation today. It's a really fascinating topic, and I'll go through various elements of stress and burnout, and also give you some tips that you can start to implement straight away, and a bit of a dive into conscious leadership. It's a big topic. I can't possibly cover all of it, but I'm going to give you a snapshot of what it is because it's becoming more and more important today. So just, I think, give it one more minute. So thank you to everyone that's joined already. So we've got Hay-on-Wye, Bicester, Leicester, Nairobi, Norwich, Macclesfield, London and Vilnius, Cambridge. Lovely part of the world. And again, if you want to ask questions, I'll leave questions until the end, but drop your questions in the chat box. If you don't want everyone to see your question, then just drop it to me. You can do a direct message to me in the chat. So I'll make a note to try and answer as much as I can. I won't read out the names of who's asked the questions in case it's something that you just want to ask for yourself personally. But I'm sure your question will benefit everyone. So please do ask away. And we are going to follow up with the slides and with a recording certainly afterwards, so you can watch it again. And if there's any questions I don't get to, then I will follow up. But on that note, it's 3 minutes past 12, so I think I'll get going. And firstly, I'd like to welcome you to this discussion today about stress, burnout, and conscious leadership, and how conscious leadership can really help alleviate, mitigate the feelings and the experience of stress and burnout, not just for you, but perhaps for your team as well. And even though this presentation is about the workplace and how it manifests in the workplace, everything that I talk about today will help you in your personal life, in dealing with situations with your family. So that will be helpful as well. And if you're a business owner, it's completely relevant to you as well. So all of the topics here that I'm going to discuss today are extremely relevant. So my name's Sarah, and I think we'll get going. So let me just move the slides on. So these are the topics that I'm going to cover today. So I'm going to cover what actually is stress and burnout. Are they the same? Are they different? How do they interact with each other? What causes it? But also some of the signs and symptoms. So I will say I'm not a medical doctor, but I do a lot of work in this area. I have dealt with a lot of executives that come to me extremely burnt out, and if you're attuned to what stress and burnout looks like, it's very obvious when someone comes to you and you can see that in them. So I'm going to cover off what causes it, some of the signs and the symptoms. There are many signs and symptoms of both of those conditions, and I think it's worth noting that it's a very individual experience for each person. So no two persons' experiences will be the same. Depends on the circumstances and many other things, which I'll go on to later. Sorry. And then just to flick back to that, how becoming a conscious leader can help. Okay, so conscious leadership is an area that's been growing over time, and it's not related to any doctrines or religion. It's actually related to conscious capitalism. So I'm going to go into that later on in the presentation, as in, conscious capitalism is really about how does an organization really work with all of its stakeholders, and that includes leaders and employees, to ensure that we are being good corporate citizens, that we are aware of our impact on society, that we are aware of our impact on the environment. And actually, studies have shown that many companies that adopt a conscious leadership approach actually see sustained growth over the longer term and greater employee retention and identification of talent. So conscious leadership is a part of what we call conscious capitalism, and it's an evolution of what was called transformational leadership, which you might be far more aware of. So adopting conscious leadership there are different branches of conscious leadership. It's a big topic. I can't cover all of it today, but I will give you some tips from the school of thought of conscious leadership and where I've studied this particular area to make sure you've got something you can take away for yourself and your teams. So I'll go into that in a bit more detail. So tips we can use and then questions at the end, as I mentioned. So let me just kick off with a bit of my story. So my name's Sarah and I requalified as a coach 7 years ago now, I think. So I'm an accredited qualified coach. And over the years of growing up, and also culminating with my coach training, I did really study consciousness and spirituality. And whilst this presentation isn't really about spirituality in that sense, some aspects of conscious leadership do go into spiritual practices. But I blend my coaching and my understanding of consciousness and conscious leadership to help executives beat burnout, beat stress, find a career that they love, really be the architects of their own career, so the pilot, not the passenger of their own career. And also I help leaders to become more conscious, forward thinking, self-aware, and that really helps to build cohesive teams, and it helps them to reduce stress and burnout because it improves relationships. It helps you to deal with conflict that much more easily. It helps you to put boundaries in place to help you in your career. So I work with individuals and I work with teams in companies. So, but my background before coaching was in what we call corporate affairs, which is a very posh word for leading communications across the organisation. So internal, external, government affairs. And actually, when I was starting out, or when I was in my career in the kind of, I think, late 90s, 2000s, as I was building a team, I realised I needed to have someone in what we called at the time corporate social responsibility, which I didn't know a lot about, but I definitely employed someone that did. So that's leadership tip number one. You don't need to know everything. You just need to be a good leader, and don't be scared of employing people around you that know far more about certain areas than you do. So it was corporate social responsibility was included in that, and that's where, you know, the concept of an organisation playing its part for the good of society really started to take hold in terms of, you know, people, environment, society, and we can see that evolution. I worked for DHL. I was their global head of communications because I moved from XL PLC, where I was a board member by the time I was 30, and I moved into DHL when there was mergers and acquisitions. So I've done tons of mergers and acquisitions work from a communications standpoint and dealt with a lot of change. At DHL, I was there for about, I think, 8 to 9 years. I reported directly into the CEO, and what a fantastic CEO he was. I was the only woman in the boardroom, but he listened and asked questions, even though he might have known the answers himself, but great CEO. And that company really suited me because by nature, I'm a very outgoing, bubbly, optimistic person that likes to build relationships, and I build relationships quickly, but I'm also quite a driver type. I like to achieve, and that was certainly in the environment I found myself in DHL, which was great. And just my little story of burnout, I think the time that I felt it the most was when I was moving across to different cultures. It wasn't necessarily the skills that I was using of my craft in terms of communications and government affairs, but it was the culture. And we actually, as DHL merged, we had a public-private merger of logistics and supply chain with the NHS. And I was really, really pleased to be asked to lead the communications on that front, particularly supporting the CEO, who was a new CEO and needed some guidance. But you know, I love the NHS. I'm sure, like most of you, it's not my family, it's not my friends. I'm a big supporter of it, but the culture coming in was very different. And for me, it took me a long time to realize that I needed to adapt my style and learn some new skills. And this was at a time when leadership coaching and development wasn't really that common. So I felt on my own. I think by nature, due to various circumstances in life, and the way I go about things, I'm a resilient, tenacious person. But at that point, it was, hang on a minute, I'm using all of my tools in the toolbox and it's not working because I had definitely a couple of people in my team that frankly, and you know, good luck to them, weren't happy with the change and were actively quite toxic, as you know, and as a leader who has always wanted to support my team and ensure they have fulfilling careers that suit their lives, you know, that fit their lives, not the other way round. I found that quite difficult. My ego took a bit of a blow, and on top of that, heavy workloads, because as we were going through the transition, I couldn't tell the rest of my team what was happening until I could tell them. And so my exercise habits slipped, my sleeping patterns went out the window a bit, and I remember feeling just distinctly burnt out. And I think that probably caused me at a certain point in time to decide, do you know what, enough is enough. I can't really see an end to this. And that's one of the things with burnout, not seeing an end to something, the kind of demands that were being put upon me. And I wasn't really getting the support I needed as a leader. I was a self-starter, so I found my own way around things, but I definitely remember feeling burnt out. But I've also, you know, it was an experience and I learned from it, and nothing's a failure if you learn, right? I've written a book, I've worked for the NHS, as I mentioned, I've worked for Abbott, I've worked for Astellas, Johnson & Johnson, lots of companies doing traditional training type projects and coaching work. And you can see some of my coaching clients on the website. So that's my experience of burnout. So have you ever felt like this or something like that? So really, just to make you aware that stress and burnout is very, very common. And according to studies, 76% of people, and this is UK figures, suffer from stress every year, and 30% of people feel that they have more than 10 days a month where they're really, really stressed, and 7% of people feel stressed every day. So stress is a wide topic, and I'm going to cover the different parts of stress in a moment, but that's quite a big number. 76 people are suffering from stress significantly, like moderate to severe stress in the UK. And it's also reported that 7 million employees per year do feel that they suffer burnout. And these are all statistics that can be substantiated. From my work in pharmaceuticals, I know it's important to substantiate what we talk about. So, but 7 million people a year suffer burnout. And that's, I think, the work days that are lost just to burnout each year in the UK economy are 23.3 million days per year. So those are big, big numbers, and it costs the UK industry 28 billion per year. So there's a human, health and financial burden and cost to what's going on here. And I think, you know, we can see that in the NHS as well, with some of the demands put on them from a mental health perspective. But stress and burnout are really, really interesting. It's a bit of a chicken and egg situation, because there's a school of thought that suggests stress leads to burnout. And then there's another school of thought that suggests burnout leads to stress. And I think my personal view is that does it really matter? What matters is recognizing in yourself, for your team and for yourself, whether you are suffering the effects of stress. That's the important piece to know, and to understand yourself and your own personality. So, for example, if you've never had a psychometric profiling tool, I use one called DISC, and I use one that's called The Work of Leaders. I use one called Time Mastery, Personal Effectiveness. I use lots of different tests to really help my clients identify their personality and identify some of their blind spots. And some of this does go towards mitigating stress. And apparently, when you do a psychometric profile, whatever that may be, it leads to a 19% drop in stress and burnout and greater awareness of what you're doing. So it actually aids this aspect of consciousness that I'm going to talk about today. So as you can see, it's a very, very common issue. And personally speaking, and I've got some diagrams that I'll share with you in a minute, as I mentioned, I think the important thing is to recognize when it affects you. Now, stress, let me go on to what the different elements of stress are, okay? Because stress is very multifaceted. Some of you may have seen a graph like this before. So on the vertical level, we've got performance, low to high, and then we've got stress on the horizontal. And what this graph is telling us that there's a certain level of stress that really gets us in the zone, that gets us in the flow, and that aids performance. And that's called eustress. And you might have heard of this word before. And for example, if I'm working for a pharmaceutical company or any company, it doesn't matter, and I'm given what is called a stretch or grow assignment, you might have different words for those where you work. Or maybe if you're running your own business, you've decided I'm going to set my own stretch goal or grow assignment and learn about digital marketing, for example. But if I'm in a role and I'm given a stretch assignment or a grow assignment, and I say, oh yeah, that sounds fantastic, but I'm not really that enthused by it, that eustress is not going to be there. I'm going to tip into distress. But for somebody else, for example, if I'm in a company and I talk to my manager, I'm very open, it's a two-way conversation, my manager is listening, asking relevant questions, and I get to receive a stretch or grow assignment, which is in, for example, let's just say digital marketing again, you know, or managing digital patient trials or something like that. And that's something that I really, really want to do. I'm going to be in the zone, you know, and with that, you've got a greater more fuel in the tank to deal with the stress of starting with that new role, that new project. And that's really when you're in the zone. But when we get to this point where stress continues over a long period of time, it becomes chronic stress. It actually becomes chronic stress, which then becomes a condition or a situation where you as a manager might need to look out for the signs and the symptoms and really understand what's going on with your employees, because that is not good for anybody's health over a long period of time. And in fact, that chronic stress then moves into distress, and then from there you can actually have some more significant concerns such as panic attacks, might start leading to anxiety and eventually depression. Sorry, I know this isn't a very happy slide, but I just want to explain to you what happens with stress, because it's a very multifaceted area. So you can see there's good stress. I mean, athletes would attest to this all the time. I used to do deep sea diving, and before I went in, I'd be stressed. I mean, why wouldn't you be? If you're diving to 100 meters, that's not a normal thing to do. But I would harness that stress because I had experience in that area of diving. Athletes train to deal with that stress as well. So that stress can be a sort of force for good, in the same way that sometimes fear can be fuel, for example. But we don't want too much fear. We don't want too much stress to tip us into distress. And I think what happens here, bearing in mind those two examples I've shared of the stretch and the grow assignment examples, is that really the reaction to stress is about your own personal interpretation of the stressor. Now, stress can be many things. It can be physical. So maybe there's an injury that you weren't expecting and it's stressing you out because you can't exercise, you can't get around as much as you would like to. There's behavioural stress, there's mental stress, which can be just through overwork, or I don't know, perhaps you're not getting on with your partner or something like that. Emotional, that can be related to your personal life or something that's happening with your family or even work. You know, maybe you're not feeling that you're being recognised, and that could lead to some emotional stress. Lifestyle. I've coached people that have come to me just completely burnt out because it's, well, Sarah, I got the role that I wanted, but now I'm here. My lifestyle is just all over the place and I'm not seeing my family. So we recalibrate how we can get that to work and have the relevant conversations, conscious conversations with their companies to address that imbalance. So there can be lifestyle changes. Organizational, I mean, this year, let's face it, it's another interesting one, isn't it? You know, we've had the pandemic and, you know, there's a lot of restructuring going on. So for some people who perhaps haven't been through a restructuring before, or actually they want to stay in the company where they are, but that's not possible, that organizational stress is going to be quite complex to deal with. Whereas if you're somebody perhaps going through an organizational restructure and you've been with a company for 20 years and you know you're happy that you've done what you needed to, it might be a bit stressful, but not as stressful as it was for the first person. So it's like a lot of things in life, very situation specific. There's financial stress as well, and social stress. So it's worth identifying the source of that stress and really asking yourself about what is your interpretation of that stress. So stress really comes down to, I think, identifying what it is, interpreting what it is, your interpretation of it. For some people, you know, I work with a lot of new leaders, new managers, and sometimes they can be very, very overwhelmed. And we have to look at their default leadership style and look at more conscious and adaptive approaches to leadership. So it's your interpretation of the stressor, the emotional resources that you have to deal with it. So I've studied positive psychology, conscious leadership, and actually one of the most important attributes we can acquire, learn in life is resilience. And resilience is literally based on the Latin word, which means to ping back, like an elastic band, to bounce back from things. And if we have situation after situation after situation, that resilience tank can drop. So it's like fuel in a car, you're running on fumes. So the stress is building. But if you've got the emotional resources and you've looked at some skills around building resilience, such as analysing, okay, what's the source? What strategies have I used before? Did they work? Which ones didn't work? That's a nice resilience exercise. And I share a lot of these with my clients because it is, I believe, the number one, and positive psychology tells us it is the number one skill set needed in life, you know, to really deal with the world that we live in. So what emotional resources do you have to deal with that at that time? And be honest with yourself. Perhaps you could look at it and think, okay, let's look at this stressful situation. From 1 to 10, how stressful? Right, it's a 9. From 1 to 10, what resources? Where am I percentage-wise and where I feel I can deal with this? 40%. Right, okay, let's reflect then and think, well, where can I get help? And there's tons of help out there, charities. A lot of companies have mental health first aiders. I'm a qualified mental health first aider that can point you in the right resources. We've got listening ears. I don't know if any of you use the listening ears scheme. And obviously there's lots of coaches, mentors and people you can turn to. Sometimes it's best to turn to someone who perhaps is objective and neutral, so that a coach, a mentor can help because they're designed to be very objective about your situations. Not all the time, but sometimes if we tell friends and family, they give us their advice and it's based on their history and not always the best way to go. So, you know, and where can I get the support? So have a look at those 3 bullet points, you know, when we send out the slides, etc. Have a think about those. Where would you score yourself in this particular situation? And if you've got more than one stressor, maybe give them a quantitative number, and add them up. Maybe give them scores out of 10 or something. Work it in a grid and just see, okay, where am I now? Where's my set point? But what happens over time is, well, stress is a reaction to something. So if I'm about to leave the office and someone dumps something on my desk and says, can you do that by tonight? That might feel a bit stressful to me. And it might feel really stressful to me if I feel that I want to say no and I don't know how to and decide to do the work. We're over tolerating. And stress tends to be a reaction to day-to-day events. And as I said, it can build up over time. But stress and overload over that prolonged period of time can lead to burnout. So prolonged distress can lead to burnout, and it's at the end of the continuum. And it really is about when small tasks just become too much for you. It's even like getting out of bed is difficult. So I'm going to go through some of the signs and symptoms now. So it is a continuum. There is a discussion about, does one lead to the other? And I don't think it matters. What I think matters is recognizing and understanding your own style, your own behaviors, and what you need to adapt. Okay, so signs and symptoms. So it's a continuum. But when we look at stress, and stress and burnout do share some of the same symptoms, when we look at the signs and symptoms, stress can be, I mean, it's so multifaceted, depends on the individual. And I'm not a medical doctor, but I've just run through some of the ones that I have discussed with my clients. You can have breathing issues, panic attacks, headaches, eye disturbances, sleep disturbances, nausea, dizziness, getting into bad habits, substance abuse, breathing issues, hypertension, things like that, high blood pressure. I think I mentioned dizziness and just irritability, moodiness. So there's a whole bunch of symptoms that are aligned to feeling stressed, okay? And as I mentioned before, this can apply to any situation in life. And it might be, if you think about the pandemic, it might have been that you were really, really busy during the pandemic. You weren't furloughed, or maybe you were furloughed, and that was stressful for you psychologically. And you had things going on with your family. So you can see how these things can compound together. Burnout, however, and I've seen it in my clients, as I think I've mentioned, is a bit more nuanced. Yes, it shares some of the symptoms of stress. But burnout is something else. It's the complete draining of the battery. If you imagine a candle that has a wick burning, I think of it like a wick burning slowly down. You might not notice it at first until the candle goes out and you realize the wick's burnt out. So burnout is really, I align it to that in terms of overwhelming exhaustion, being depleted of energy. There's also a mental distance and detachment from things, and almost sometimes people can almost kid themselves that they're okay because they're detached, but they're not really, you know, they're still dealing with things under the surface. So it's this exhaustion, this depletion, this running on empty. And one of the curious symptoms about burnout is it's attributed to cynicism and feeling detached from the job or the task. I think this detachment is a big thing, this kind of giving up, hitting the brick wall, the cynicism, as in perhaps if you're usually quite a positive person, you'll notice a very cynical mindset coming in, a bit victim mindset, and that can be a sign of burnout. Foggy thinking, you know, that brain fog, that can happen, particularly with burnout. It's been noted in studies. Just feeling unappreciated, you know, you're just like, you know, this kind of thing, feeling unappreciated. And then there's the obvious things like absenteeism, missing deadlines, and a sense of not being productive, accomplished, or effective. You might be somebody that is a real driver type, and it's like, whoa, you know, you're 100% is somebody else's 200%. You could be somebody that puts a lot of pressure on yourself, or is a high achiever, or a people pleaser, or a perfectionist, and maybe there's something there you need to look at. So just be careful with thinking you're not productive, because sometimes this burnout really skews our view of life. Things become very foggy, we do become very depleted, and this mental detachment does take place. And you'll see a picture of a snowball hitting a tree there. That's not just a random picture. That's my way of thinking about burnout, that also we've got the candle that's burning down, literally, but we've got a snowball that gets bigger and bigger and bigger as it rolls down the hill, and until it hits a tree. And that's what burnout feels like. So hopefully some of those examples work for you. So why do we get turning to burnout, which does happen over time? It does happen over time. These things really creep up on you. I know from my experience of having it, you know, I think if you've got a high capacity for workload and stress in a way, you can deal with things quite well until you can't really. So it builds up over time. It's draining of the resources. Therefore, anything else that comes into your world or comes into work is going to be even more stressful. So that's back to the chicken and egg situation. They probably feed off each other. And it seems really that, I think, from what I see from my clients, is that workplace stress isn't still being managed that well or recognized, because you might have somebody in your team, or you might be somebody yourself who is much more introvert and you don't share what's going on with you. So people that can be quite introvert, that are team players, are very loyal, they'll put other people ahead of themselves, and they might go, yeah, I'm fine, I'm okay. But, watch their behaviors, watch their actions, look at their hours, and make sure that they are okay. I had a team member once, and she was always late in the office. And to me, that didn't sit well with me, and I wanted to lead by example by leaving on time as much as I could. And I was conscious that sometimes I couldn't. So I sat and had a chat with her and said, look, I know sometimes I work long hours, but I'm not expecting that of you. What's going on? Is there something I can help you with? Da, 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 da. And she wouldn't tell me at first. But it took a bit of time, and she opened up and she said, well, actually, my old boss is still giving me work. And she didn't want to let people down. She didn't want to let people know. And she was literally, like, you could see, sort of spinning the wheels, really. So I was like, okay, let me deal with this. Sometimes it takes a bit of time. But yeah, so typically, these are the reasons why in the workplace we suffer from burnout. So these are some of the areas you might have seen, in terms of, you've got a heavy workload, you're working long hours. Sometimes there are times in life where we might have to do that, but if it's on a sustained level, we're not going to be able to do it. We are going to burn out, because we're robots, we're human beings, we're not human doings. So, and I think if you're a leader also, that's another tip there. I'm not saying you don't do that already, but please recognize that we value the whole person in conscious leadership, in terms of who they are at work, who they are at home, everything about them, their interests. We see them as a whole person. And very often business is predicated on what I deliver. How many PowerPoints can I send out? How much can I do? What's the volume? What's the pace? And we know those things are important. We know it's important that things have to get done, projects have to get done, but not at the expense of the doing. Doesn't come at the expense of the being. And during the pandemic, I was working with a lot of people, and I was asking them, how many Teams meetings are you having? I'm having 35 hours a week. Whoa, hold it. Would you be doing that in real life? No. Okay, so what are you doing differently? What's going on here? And we would unpick that. So remember, human beings, not human doings, okay? And I'm sure you do that already, but just think about that person in front of you as being a whole person with their own struggles and issues, etc. So let's look at their workloads, let's look at their hours and address those where they need to be addressed. Struggling with work-life balance, that can happen. We're in a society where both parents work sometimes, balancing childcare, or going through massive changes, staffing reductions, for example. It's very prevalent in the healthcare sector and the care sector, as I'm sure you may be aware, in the helping professions. And really, burnout for me is like, I feel that I have no control over my work. And that might not be vocalized to you if you are leading a team, but that's what it feels like. And I've coached a number of people where they've come to a call and they're like this, they look tired. And some of these people that I've coached, I've known from my previous life, professional life in communications, in pharma, in other sectors. And it's like, wow, what's going on? It's visible, the body language, I just don't know what I'm doing anymore, Sarah. And within a matter of weeks, they look completely different. The posture's different, the smile's back on, the skin's glowing, because I've helped them to regain some control over their own mindset and what's happening at work, the internal, because the internal comes first, then the external follows. So when we look at ourselves and adapt, then sometimes what happens is we affect the outside. But this idea of like no control over your work is a big one. No reward and recognition. That's also a huge area where people feel that they don't feel recognized and leave companies. And remember, again, this is part of being a conscious leader. Recognition is different things to different people. Some people, employees, won't really appreciate being called out in public. It has to be meaningful recognition. I've worked in companies where it's recognition after recognition and it doesn't really mean anything. For some people, it has to really mean something. And being presented in public with a gift or a recognition, that might not work for your team member. Some team members would like for you just to say, do you know what, thank you so much for what you did on that project. So be mindful with recognition that you understand your team and how they like to be recognized, okay? I remember working for a company and I came in to redesign their recognition program because the current recognition scheme was to travel, have a fantastic fun-filled trip abroad. But when I was speaking to people, it's like, but I'm in a sales team, I'm on the road all the time, I want to spend time with my family. I don't really want this. I'd rather just have some vouchers to take my kids to the cinema. So we did a number of blended recognition schemes. So be aware of that. Poor relationships, poor time management, not understanding the difference between urgent, important, and the various parameters of that, and organising your time. Sometimes we get into the habit of being in this place of stress and overwhelm. It gets an uncomfortable comfort zone, but it's not sustainable. It really isn't. So look at how you manage your time, and look at boundaries. This is one of the most common ones, boundaries and assertiveness. I think people are sometimes scared of being assertive and setting boundaries. And setting boundaries means they're not boundaries like a barbed wire or electric fence. It's actually a discussion and a conversation with another person, perhaps, to say, well, look, hang on a minute. I feel that this is really part of your role. Can we go off and have a discussion about that? And don't make assumptions. So boundaries, really, really huge, comes up all the time in my coaching. So we talked about individual styles already. So what's your style? Are you a perfectionist? Are you a high achiever? Were you told as a child, work harder, work harder, work harder? Part of understanding your history is part of understanding your inner self and becoming a conscious leader so you can help to shape and work with other people. Do you people please? And of course, toxic culture goes without saying. I've coached a number of people and it's been quite staggering. And some of these are quite significant brands that have still got a toxic leadership culture, which for me is very much about the instructional, directional style of leadership. There is a time for that kind of leadership, absolutely, in a crisis situation, for example, but the kind of leadership where it's one way, I'm going to tell you what to do, you're going to do it as though we're still working in a field or a factory, doesn't really cut it anymore for people. People want to feel engaged, and younger generations will push back. I'm noticing that younger generations rising up, they will ask difficult questions and disagree with their leaders. So brace yourself. Anyway, so what can you do for employees? Here's a starter for 10 as we get into conscious leadership. Okay, so we talked about control over work. Can you help them get that? Can you coach them? Can you mentor them? Can you get them a mentor? How do you run your team? Honestly, how do you run your team? Are there pinch points? Have you talked to your team about some of those exercises, that exercise I mentioned earlier, and some of the exercises that will follow, some of the tips? Could you run that within your team to get a real snapshot of what stress and overwhelm is like for people? Feedback, 100%. Oh my goodness, this is so important. Again, with boundaries and assertiveness, it's such a massive area that I coach in. Some people don't do it at all, and some people don't do it very well. And there are a number of ways to do it effectively. It's got to be related to the role, and it can't just be a throwaway comment of you'll say this and you'll say that. That's not going to help someone that's feeling stressed and burnt out. Substantiated feedback. And actually, when you create a feedback loop and a culture of feedback in your team, you start to identify who's the future talent. You build trust within your team. You identify challenges you didn't know exist. You spot innovation. So it's fantastic. It's not just about you giving feedback, it's about you receiving feedback. reverse mentoring from your team, and creating that culture of feedback that allows you to spot issues before they arise. And studies show that actually the broader employee base of any company, they know 94% of your company's problems, whereas leadership only knows 6%. And I'm not trying to denigrate leaders by saying that. It's just the nature of the beast that if you're involved in higher up discussions and shareholders, etc., you might not be so close to what's happening on the ground. I'm sure we've all been there where it's like, oh, why are they changing this? It's this, that's the issue. Make sure you have health and wellbeing programs as well in place. There's lots of companies that can help you with that, and give employees time if they have had a situation, have an adequate plan, work with HR if they have burnt out and need to come back. Okay, so let's set the scene for conscious leadership. Yeah, we all know this acronym, I think. This is the world we're living in for many, many different reasons. I think the last few years have shown us that. And the world continues to show us this, that it's volatile, uncertain, complexity, and ambiguous at times. And that's where resilience comes in. There are many, many skill sets that are important in life. Self-awareness, I would put top of the list. Confidence is important, based on a level of self-esteem first. You can't have those things without self-esteem, but resilience and persistence is really important. So let's bump into conscious leadership now. What's it about? Okay, so it's been around for a while, since it started growing in the 90s after, remember a time when we've had multiple financial scandals going on, and from that was born a look at, hang on a minute, how do we do business? What's the right way to do business? And you've got FTSE for Good and other indices that measure companies and how they're actually working in the environment. And from that, this book was written called Conscious Leadership. It's not the only book, but it's one of the first ones. And what it said was that conscious leadership is a part of conscious capitalism. And we can see that today with how companies are being measured on their ESG goals, in terms of, the evolution of corporate social responsibility, in terms of environment, society, your impact on the world. And it really looks at, actually, we're an evolved company. We look beyond making profit, although companies that embrace conscious capitalism are shown to have a greater rate of employee retention and a longer trajectory of wealth building over time. So they tend to be more profitable because, quite frankly, you're in tune with what society and what your employees want and what's going on in society. So how could that not make you successful? So it's evolved capitalism. It's looking at the development of all humanity, sustainable success. So it's not I win, you lose. It's a win-win way of looking at things. And social good is one of the key objectives, not just for you, but your supply chain, your clients, and obviously your team. So conscious leadership is a part of conscious capitalism. And conscious leadership has really evolved from transformational leadership. So we've had transformational leadership, servant leadership as well, if you've heard of that. And it's really an evolution of those areas. It's a fascinating topic as well. So let's look at some additional tips. I gave you a few tips earlier about maybe looking at sources of stress and taking a real temperature check and set point of where you are now. Let's dive into a couple of techniques here from Conscious Leadership. So I've studied with the Conscious Leadership group. This is a really good book. And when we look at conscious leadership specifically, it might have a spiritual element to it for you, or it might just that might mean for you that I want to be conscious of my choices and aware of what I'm doing. I'm going to take 100% responsibility for my life and my circumstances, and I'm going to help other people to do the same. Because believe you me, having been on this journey and studied and qualified in this area, my life's got a whole lot better in terms of dealing with issues, conflict, and inverted commas, difficult people. I call it inside out leadership, because I feel that we have to be aware of ourselves. We have to understand ourselves to be able to help other people. And if we've been on that journey as a leader, we can help other people. And for me, leadership generally is a mindset. We can read books, podcasts, listen to a talk like this and learn something from that. But for me, leadership is a mindset that we need to broaden. It's not just about telling people what to do, but it might actually be about how we live our whole life. Because for me, leadership is around self-leaderships, and then elevating to self-mastery, where we do take responsibility, and we try not to get into the victim mode. So you've got this exercise here, above the line and below the line. And I guess it kind of aligns to having that fixed or open mindset as well, because below the line, it speaks to a fixed mindset. Above the line speaks to a flexible, open mindset. And when we've got a flexible, open mindset and we're behaving, acting in a more conscious way, we're open, we're curious, we're committed to learning. We're below the line, we're defensive, we're committed to being right, we're being a victim, we're closed off. And, you know, we might best be somewhere in between. And this isn't designed to ensure that we're perfect all of the time, because we're not robots. And in a busy work environment, this line's going to be like a heartbeat going up and down all, you know, during the day. But what I'd like you to do is maybe take this image, you can find it on the internet, or I can send you the slides, and really plot some points about, hang on a minute, how much am I above the line and how much am I below the line? Because if you're more above the line and below the line, you're doing really well, because I believe you me, I know what it's like working in small organizations that have grown, huge organizations that are really complex, and the demands you put upon there. But what I found was, when I became more conscious about my leadership style and adapted it and took on some of these practices, then my life just got a lot better and I was able to lead my team better. So are you above the line or are you below the line? So have a look throughout the day, have a think about it, because this is just about raising self-awareness. These are the entry points, and it's not about beating yourself up. It's just about becoming aware of where you are. Okay, so attributes of a conscious leader. I've talked about inside out leadership, where we have to become aware of how we lead how we lead generally. So I talked about the DISC profiling, the Work of Leaders report, which looks at, if you're a leader, the vision, the alignment and the execution that you set around your business strategies. And it actually looks at how you stack up against other leaders. Now, I'm not always a massive fan of comparisons, but in this case, it really works to see, well, hang on a minute, what are the more successful conscious leaders doing these days? And where do I ladder up to some of those people? So really understanding your own style and your own blind spots is really important, because if we don't, we're just projecting all of our stuff onto other people. It's like we're kind of vomiting all of our issues onto other people, and that might be the team that you're leading. So do some of that analysis, and there's a great free tool called StrengthsFinder. Find out what your strengths are, whatever it is you choose to do, you know, lead from the inside out. Okay, and that really speaks to that self-awareness piece, in terms of self-aware leaders are much more effective leaders. So what can you do to build your awareness? And this awareness is, when you raise your own self-awareness, you raise your awareness of other people, you start to notice expressions, micro expressions in people, body language, reactions. You start to notice, particularly if you do the above and below the line exercise, hang on a minute, there's some situations here where I always, quite frankly, kick off, or where I'm not at my best. What is that about? What is that really about? What's going on? What's triggering me? And that's something you can use to ask yourself questions such as, hang on a minute, I've done the line exercise over, you know, a couple of weeks now, and I'm noticing this. Is that really something that bothers me? Am I holding on to something? What is it that's really behind that stress, that burnout, you know? So the conscious leadership will help you reduce those conflicts, reduce those long hours, and become much more aware of some of the outdated thinking patterns and behaviors that you may have. So self-awareness is really important. It helps you to preserve energy, maintain a positive mindset, and help your team, help yourself and help your team. And it protects against stress, etc. Purpose. Leaders that are conscious, they have a purpose. They bring a sense of purpose to their role. I don't know if you've ever met somebody like that, where it just feels so authentic about, you know, how they like to do things, what they're passionate about, and it really boosts your well-being. Studies show that it boosts well-being and helps you stay motivated. So acting with purpose means that successful leaders can focus their energy on the tasks and activities that are really important. They're leading with intention, they're leading with purpose. Now, ask yourself, am I doing that? Or am I a bit of a cork bobbing in the wind? And be quite frank with yourself. You know, in my career currently, do I feel that purpose? If I don't, where can I find that purpose? So for me, when I was working in pharmaceutical companies, for me, in the communications arena, corporate affairs, I found my sense of purpose in doing patient advocacy. I love it. I still do it to this day. I'd still do projects on it because I love that aspect of, you know, working with scientific companies that are producing things that help people and really helping patients and hearing those patient stories. It really grounds me and reminds me of what's important in life. So maybe there's something like that you need to do. Resilience, we've talked about that. That is about preserving energy. So think about with resilience, where do I give my energy away? Where does my mindset slip? And, you know, find the best ways to work sustainably. Self-care, really important. Exercise, sleep, meditation, mindfulness, they are important. If something, I teach a lot of my clients, and I work with all different clients of ages and genders, mindful moments. You know, if you're not really into mindfulness, you're in a stressful situation, take a sip of water, just pick up your pen, something like that. So there's lots of different self-care regimens you can look at and ask yourself, how committed are you to your self-care? Otherwise, if you're not, it does lead to emotional fatigue. Empathy, that needs to come from the top as well. All of this stuff needs to come from the top. It needs to be ingrained into the company culture, and to able to support yourself and your teams. And if it's not, it's really, really obvious. And it's, I've worked with people that, I've coached people where, you know, they had the burning desire to improve their role in their career and they just couldn't because of the environment. So self-care and well-being from the top, humility, compassion, and remember that we're human beings, not doings. Now, those aren't all the attributes of conscious leadership. There's more in some of the books that you'll see about it, but those are some of the key ones. But it is a multifaceted topic. So just to sum up with some practices, okay? Triggers. Keep a journal of your triggers. Right, what's triggering me? Earlier on in the presentation and throughout the presentation, I've given you a few other tips. So listen again, and those questions that I asked, that reality check of stress, percentages, try that exercise and then look at triggers. Try the above and below the line exercise. Don't worry if it's not a straight line and it's a bit like that, that happens. Work of leaders report helps to identify triggers and blind spots. I mean, we can just about see the end of our own nose. So how are we supposed to see inside our own heads and the way that we work? So the work of leaders report is a good psychometric profiling tool. Boundaries, set boundaries with people. So many people don't do this. And again, it doesn't mean about being aggressive with people. It just means being clear that actually I see that as your role, not my role. Or perhaps you've got somebody that, I don't know, talks a lot in meetings and I don't know, and you can ask them to be more concise. I'm just pulling off examples. So recognize your boundaries. Doesn't have to be a long list, just a few. They can be physical, financial, mental, professional, all sorts of different boundaries. Assertiveness, nothing wrong with being assertive. People will respect you more if you are assertive. So assertiveness does come into play. The mindful moments in meditation. There's something you can do to change state straight away. Change your posture and talk about the issue for 1 minute. If there's an issue, it might sound a bit strange talking to yourself, but it's really helpful to hear what you're thinking out loud. Change your posture and talk about the issue you're dealing with for 1 minute. Get it off your chest and see how that feels. And then what I want you to do is, whether you do it aligned to that change posture exercise or independently, is facts versus story. And that's where this diagram comes in. And this is from a gentleman called Gay Hendricks, hendricks.com. And to be honest, he was one of the early proponents of conscious leadership. His has quite a spiritual lilt to it, which is fine. There's nothing wrong with that. Whether you express things in psychological, spiritual, or other terms, that's fine. But this whole, if we don't separate the facts of this is actually what happened, this is the story I'm telling myself, we get into drift. And drift means we lose our presence because something's happened. It's happened to us. Oh dear, I'm a victim. We get into drift, and then we get into the drama triangle. And there's 3 people in that triangle, and you might be any one of them at one point, the villain, the hero, or the victim. So I'll just touch on that for now. So separate facts from story, feedback I've talked about, and am I reacting or responding? If we're reacting, it's that fight, flight, freeze type response. You know, it's, oh dear, the saber-toothed tiger is going to get me. Am I reacting or am I taking time to respond? It's really important that you take time and choose your responses. This is what conscious leadership is about. Even if you hear something that does trigger you, that's fine. But am I aware of my response? Talked about drifting. So there's a whole list of what drifting means. Procrastination, seeking approval, checking your phone, compulsive working. Drifting means I'm not actually aligned to what I'm doing here. I notice some patterns in myself that aren't working anymore. I'm drifting. I'm not really being aware, conscious, and present for myself or my team. There's a longer list of that. If you'd like to see that longer list, then do get in touch and I can share it with you. So it's been wonderful to have you here on this webinar today. It's a topic I'm really passionate about. I've just done a tip of the iceberg part of it. It would be lovely if you would connect with me on LinkedIn. You can book a free call to discuss anything further. I will send out the recording of this webinar so you can see it at a later date. I am running a conscious leadership program, and for those of you that are on this webinar today, there's 50% off. That's an offer that's going to be available for the next week. So please let me know, otherwise it does go up to its usual price, but I'm more than happy as a thank you and gratitude for you being here to offer you 50% of my conscious leadership program. And honestly, if it does change your life when you start to lead in a more conscious way. And coming soon, I'm going to start building a conscious leadership community via LinkedIn. So a private club, an exclusive club of people that are really, really wanting to see how conscious leadership can help them, their business, their organization, but also their own personal lives. I can see there's some questions in the chat. Let me just see if I can stop sharing. Bear with me. Stop share. There we go. Let's see, we've got some chat questions here. Oh yeah, thank you. Yeah, brilliant, great. I'm glad you all enjoyed it. If you do have any follow-up questions, then please do get in touch. There's no such thing as a silly question, as you've probably heard before, but I want to thank you again for being here, because I know this year is a very interesting year. There's lots of changes going on, and I'm sure you're all busy, but I'll send you the recording, and if you like, you can ask for the slides as well. But it's been a pleasure having you here, and look forward to seeing you soon. Okay, thank you everyone. Have a lovely day. Take care. Bye-bye.